animals are constantly communicating to us too. And it's our job to learn how to read. You used the word read earlier, which I really appreciate. Read their behavior, read what they're communicating, because arguably in the context of skill and stockmanship, it's those missed cues that typically, end up in potentially injury or bluffing or, undesirable outcomes.
Welcome to another episode of the Beef Podcast Show. My name is Dr. Stephanie Hansen. I'm a feedlot nutritionist at Iowa State University, and it is my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Dr. Ruth Woiwode, who is an extension specialist and assistant professor of animal behavior and well-being at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. She's a PACO certified animal welfare auditor across a variety, you name it, she's got the list of species there. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. And she has a bachelor's in animal science from Colorado State, and then a master's and PhD in animal sciences with an emphasis on livestock behavior, handling, and welfare, also from Colorado State University. And I'm very excited to visit with you today, Ruth. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Stephanie. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, I always start off with the first question to the guests to really help our listeners get a little bit more of an appreciation about how you got where you are today. And I think you have a pretty unique background, so I'm excited to hear kind of your origin story here. So tell us how you got involved with the beef industry.
Sure. I think my story is characterized by the term non-traditional. I grew up on a homestead operation in western North Dakota. And if you know anything about the Dakotas, most people believe that they were split inappropriately, that they should have been east and west, because there are strong cultural differences even across the beef industry from east to west on both states. But cow-calf country, wheat country, and I grew up around all major livestock species with various responsibilities related to animal care from a pretty early age, and was particularly interested in the cowboy culture myself from a very early age. And that led to the opportunity to intern and do apprenticeships with stockmen and horse trainers. And then so I spent a lot of time working across different sectors of the industry. I worked sale barns. I did day work, roping and dragging calves to the branding fire. And so that's perhaps the most, significant thing. That I have so much passion for the culture and the history of the beef industry, and the ability to have lived some of those experiences that the audience I now serve, are involved in every day, is so meaningful for me that today I'm working in a specialist position and working through my research to tackle some of the realities that they face on a daily basis, having experienced those. So interestingly enough, I earned a rodeo scholarship, or a business degree rather, on a rodeo scholarship, pursuing that love for the Western lifestyle, and used that degree in business and business administration for a couple of years before deciding that even though we were ranching on the side, that there was just this enormous gap in my life in terms of fulfillment in the career space. And so that really drove me through the process of reevaluating my trajectory. And that pointed me back to school and to Colorado State University. And I think we hear that that theme across a lot of animal scientists, that we're thinking maybe we're headed for vet school. And that was potentially on the table for me. Working with animals was absolutely part of that future. So the one thing that I did that made so much sense, and it would be some advice that I'd offer as well, is that while I was completing my bachelor's there, I made sure to made sure that my experiences were as broad as possible across all species and all sectors. And I wouldn't trade any of that. That provided the opportunity for me to be on a competitive meats judging team, which further fueled my interest and my passion in the beef industry. And actually, meats judging probably brought everything full circle for me, from production all the way to the plate. And that's where I understood really the impact of Dr. Temple Grandin's work and so many others throughout the sector, or, the supply chain, various sectors that are involved in putting a quality product on a plate. And so I had the opportunity, of course, to study with Dr. Temple Grandin, but also be mentored by others like Keith Belk and Gary Smith and Daryl Tatum, and people who all had played a part in shaping my thought and who I am today. And so those opportunities that I just wouldn't trade for the world. So that's a little bit of a long story just to get to my formal training. I did a postdoc at New Mexico State University at the Clayton Livestock Research Center, where we're looking at high-risk cattle, receiving high-risk cattle, and some of the behavioral components associated with that. Did some handling work there as well. And then went to industry. And so I developed a division of a company, and really that was focused on on-farm animal welfare auditing for Food Safety Net Services. At that time, they didn't have a presence on the on-farm side before that. And we essentially became the go-to source for animal welfare auditing on farm, starting with the dairy industry, all the way through. And in that time, I was involved in doing some of the investigative work related to allegations of abuse and neglect, particularly in the dairy industry. And that offered a completely different perspective. And that's when I really became interested in the challenges, the everyday challenges of the workforce, and particularly a really diverse workforce. And probably the biggest learning for me was that we sort of take this dismissive approach, or maybe it's a knee-jerk response when we hear of allegations. We say, there's some bad apples in the cart every once in a while. There's just some bad apples. And what I learned was that good people can do bad things. And it's not necessarily being a bad apple or a bad person, but it's often a case of not being adequately prepared or trained. And that's what really put me on the trajectory where I'm working today with stockmanship and quantifying handler skill level, and how that's related to both safety and well-being of the animal and the human.
We have a time and labor-saving product for you. Beef and Dairy Agri-Slat by Healthy Farms is your solution. No more lugging jugs around the barn every month. With Beef and Dairy Agri-Slat, you simply drop the slat through the floor twice a year, and it works to break down solids, reduces crusting and forming. To learn more, visit myhealthyfarms.com.
So let's start with maybe a definition from the professional perspective that you bring of stockmanship. I mean, I can think of it as like how I interact with my animals and, how I'm responsive to them. How would you add to that definition?
I would say that it's probably most accurate and fair to say that there's not a universal definition. And stockmanship is more a philosophy or a school of thought, and it encompasses many different practices. But the underlying idea is that we're attempting to minimize the stress of our interactions with animals, whether that's avoiding yelling, that type of thing. So it's more of a philosophy than something that's really clearly defined.
So when did you start at UNL?
I had the distinct privilege of joining UNL right in the middle of COVID. So I started in August of 2020, and I walked into a ghost town. So I feel like I've only been here actually, a year or two in the bigger scheme of things, when it's in reality over 3 years. So.
Okay, so let's start by, if any of the listeners are not familiar, tell us a little bit about some of the big changes that have been happening at your research center there in Mead, Nebraska, and just maybe start from kind of the 30,000 foot view in terms of some of the changes that have happened, and then we'll dig deeper into some of the cool research opportunities I think you're excited about.
There have been a number of efforts across the beef interest group and a number of faculty that are focused on different aspects of beef research, where we've sought and secured industry partnerships to expand the Eastern Nebraska Extension Education Center with what has been named the Klosterman Feedlot Innovation Center. And so what that facility represents is the opportunity to do additional research on a different scale. So pen size is much larger. It'll more closely resemble a commercial feedlot setting, But we'll also be able to test different conditions, different housing conditions. We will have both gabled roof and monoslope roof facilities where we'll be able to have cattle on slats. And we'll have a couple of different options in outdoor pens as well. We will include RCC, or roller compacted concrete. And so, of course, in an environment where we have, a pretty significant amount of precipitation annually, as well as humidity, that's certainly of interest as it relates to hygiene and overall performance, welfare and performance, both of cattle in this environment. But the part that gets me really excited is when we get to the handling facilities. And the handling facilities are designed, the barn is designed to include both an AeroQuip complete handling system as well as a Daniels handling system. So we'll have the Daniels Bud Box system and the AeroQuip, their newer Bud Flow system, side by side in the handling facilities that also include a classroom that's elevated. So that will provide the opportunity for instruction and observation of handling without the, as we think about bringing tours or people in to watch cattle handling or processing, right, that affects the actual process and helps, or it might impede animal movement. So taking that out of play is really important and something that we're super excited about, just many opportunities that exist in this facility.
So maybe explain to our listeners a little bit about what would be different between those two systems.
The Bud Box system has historically been contrasted sort of more by a round crowd tub system. And so the AeroQuip, the Bud Flow design is one of the newer, which is a little bit more of a hybrid. And I'll get into that in a moment. But the Bud Box system is as it sounds. It's a rectangular box, if you will, that where cattle are crowded from that area into the single file chute. But it really relies on the behavioral principle of cattle where they will tend to go back to the place they most recently came from. So by moving them into a blind box, if you will, or a dead end, they'll reach the end of that box and then turn around and begin to look for that place. As the crowd gets shut on them, the only opportunity for them to leave that space is into the single file alley, or if it's a Daniels double alley or something like that. But one of the known challenges or aspects of that particular design is that it does require the handler to be in with the cattle, which typically is understood to rely on a little bit higher skill level. There's a little more risk associated with being in closer proximity to cattle. And so many feedlot systems might have implemented a design similar to what Temple would have suggested, that would include the use of solid sides and a curved system, both to reduce distractions from the outside, but also to encourage that movement that tendency to return to where cattle came from. And the typical round crowd system includes a crowd gate, which the handler stands behind. So at a particular point, they're no longer in with the cattle, and that's always thought to be a safety measure. So as we look at the Bud Flow system, the handler will move the cattle up through the system a little bit more similarly to the traditional Bud Box, at that once the cattle are into the actual Bud Flow, which is a smaller circumference than most of our traditional tubs, that will be the point at which the handler is no longer in with the cattle. So they move up in that system a little bit further than the traditional tubs. And so again, it's a little bit more similar to a traditional Bud Box in concept. The footprint looks different still. But the thing that I also appreciate about the AeroFlow system, or the AeroQuip Bud Flow system, is that they have strategic closed sides. So there's areas where cattle can actually see through. And as we understand cattle vision and movement, we know that it is important for them to see a place to go. So the strategic placement of solid sides and use of that in a facility is something that's really important to actually facilitate optimal movement. And that's one of the things that we look forward to being able to do at the Klosterman Feedlot Innovation Center, would be to test some of those things, perhaps even different placement of solid sides or use of opaque or see-through areas in different spots or locations in those different systems.
So several years ago, we kind of ripped out our old Temple Grandin kind of sweep tub. I think cattle kind of can get stifled in there, especially the big cattle. And of course, we're weighing on a monthly basis in a research facility like ours. And we went to this sort of what I would call a modified bud box because it's a little bigger than it should be, but it was kind of based on the space constraints. And I will tell you the biggest thing that gives me heart palpitations about that is knowing that I have an undergrad or a grad student who's in that box. And so we're very careful. I mean, we're always intentional on training on our cattle handling skills, but we're really intentional on who gets that privilege of being that person there. And it's amazing. My students will say too, right? There's days where if you have one good person managing the cattle flow there, you only need one other person in the entirety of the sweep, or not the sweep, but like the snake, right? Whatever, to exactly. Run that. And then if you get a bad day started, and we're not talking bad like anybody's being mean or anything like that. It's just like one stubborn steer, and you need 5 people to get things moving. And
no, that's absolutely right. And I think you touched on something that's so important, particularly in the bud box and with this idea of skill, which attention and awareness, is a component of that. But it's those transitions, right? So moving with the cattle, following up as they move into that bud box so that you're closely behind them without pushing them too much either. So you make that transition as you close the end gate and then transition across the opening of the mouth of the single file, the snake, and then actually have those cattle pivot around you. But knowing those ideal places and being able to just make that transition quickly and smoothly, like that's even little nuances there completely change the whole flow. And once movement stopped, it's often difficult to get it restarted, particularly once you're in a processing system. Once you get into the single file, that's where we tend to have our big frustrations typically, especially in a case like that when we're working with research cattle where we tend to weigh them or process them pretty frequently. They acclimate, they habituate, and we also see a reduction in their flight zone or the approach point. So it takes more pressure to essentially get them to move because they're more comfortable with people in close proximity.
Yeah, we had a feed efficiency study we did several years ago, and part of my job was to feed out a bunch of purebred Limousin cattle. And so we were getting them from seed stock guys, and we weighed them every 2 weeks or whatever we had to do for like RFI kind of stuff. And these steers would be 1,500 pounds, just packed with muscle by the end. And those kids would have to twist their tails to get them to move anywhere because they were just like, dude, I am way bigger than you and you do not scare me.
Well, what's really interesting, you mentioned twisting tails, and I've been helping one of my new grad students on a lit review that's specific to cattle handling and skill. And some of the work done by Ed Pager in Calgary was really interesting because you mentioned twisting tails, and that's one of the things that we tend to try to stay away from. But one of the things that he found through use of preference testing and cattle showing us some of what if they prefer something over or would choose to avoid something, they don't necessarily distinguish between twisting tails and something that we would think is obviously more aversive, like electric prod use, provided, of course, we're not using too much pressure. So, the idea being that they'll accept something like that if it's not painful.
Yeah, totally. And like with this, it's kind of like just holding them about halfway down the base of the tail and just that little bit, right? It's not like a full twist, like you got a really stubborn animal you're trying to get moving forward. It's like they just need to be reminded that you were behind them and they're like, oh, you want me to go this way? Okay.
No, sometimes it's that sensory interaction where it isn't necessarily as aversive as we might think an electric prod, but it's just a little something extra that if they find it unpleasant or choose to move away from it, right, there's a natural place to go forward away from it.
Do you have any secrets to make dairy beef calves move?
But don't we all want the answer to that beyond physically pushing them?
Or standing in front of them and just being like, come this way, come chew on my fingers.
Well, and that's actually one of the things that we run into if we're thinking about handling animals, even at slaughter, for example, and particularly in a university setting where we'll oftentimes be harvesting 4-H steers. And typically we'll end up leading steers or lambs in just because of that exact reason. It's almost impossible to drive them.
Okay, so tell us a little bit. We were chatting kind of before we hit record here about kind of the total lack of publications on the kind of quantitative side. Maybe there's more on the subjective side. And I know this is one of the things you're really interested in. So in the field of stockmanship, what are some of the research studies that you're hoping you're going to be able to conduct with this new facility that has both handling setups?
Well, what I'm hoping is to be able to actually quantify, first of all, I think identifying the skills that are really relevant to handler safety as well as animal safety and well-being of both. If we think about the workforce that's employed in agriculture, which is 2% of the entire U.S. workforce, I think is one number that I've heard reported. And so a subset of that works directly with animals. But if we compare the crop production sector with the animal production sector, we see this really interesting trend. This is based on Department of Labor statistics, where we're seeing fatalities related to working with animals on a steady incline, where on the crop production side, we're seeing that decline. So we can argue that both sectors have adopted technology. So why do we see those divergent trends? Well, we obviously know there's a lot of variability that goes into, we have the human variability, but then you add animal variability, and it certainly becomes a much more dynamic situation. And if we look at the literature, the specific skill set that is really connected to both human safety and animal safety is of interest. We want to avoid injuries, obviously, during handling and potentially bruising, that type of thing. So that's obviously related to welfare. But we know that handling is certainly related to performance. And that's been one of the long or the historic interest in stockmanship. But if I were to a recent search of the literature using the term stockmanship in cattle only turns up, I think, 45 papers that even reference stockmanship. And if we look at low stress handling, I think we get 150 maybe papers ever that touches on the idea. Now, there's an enormous body of work that looks at human-animal interaction, about attitudes, that type of thing. And so there is a component of attitude, which is certainly subjective and difficult to measure. But if we think about advances in technology, and if we look at what we know about motor skills, I've been fascinated with this idea for a really long time that we ought to be able to identify particular skills that are really predictive of both human safety and animal outcomes, whether those are welfare or performance outcomes, and be able to train to objective targets. So the industry approach and the emphasis on stockmanship has been about training, like training to change behavior. But if we don't even know what skill is, if we haven't defined it, we don't have a baseline definition for that, how can we even measure, really, how can we document that our training has had any effect? Or, and we might be able to see behavior changes, but how do we know they're the right ones? So we've developed a skill assessment tool, and I've worked with Ron Gill, Kurt Pate, Temple Grandin, and others to put together a panel where we've identified essentially a core set of skills that we believe to be representative of the skill a handler would need to be successful across probably species and sectors. And we've developed a skill assessment tool then that includes about 10 tasks that capture those core skills. And we've recently been funded by NIFA to do some of the pilot work where we actually would incorporate wearables on both handlers and animals, while handlers of different self-reported skill levels. Right now in the industry, our only measure of skill or experience is a self-reported number, that years of experience. Either we grew up with it or I've worked in this space for 5 years. And so we look at handlers who have different levels of self-reported experience, and we have them complete this set of tasks while they are also scored by an expert. So we can then compare their self-reported years of experience. We can look at their self-rating, given how well they thought they performed, how they rated their skill, and we can compare that to an expert rating of their actual performance on those tests. But meanwhile, through the use of technology and wearables, we can collect continuous variables that are potentially of significant interest and something that would be very tangible as training targets, something that would be repeatable that we could train to as well.
Okay, I have several questions. So the first one, are people who have prior experience, so if I grew up with cattle, am I more likely or less likely to, okay, I have two questions here. Am I more likely to be overconfident of my skills than what I actually have? Or the second part would be, am I more likely to be successful innately than somebody who's never had that experience before? Because especially as a college professor, I see both of those, right?
Well, you hit on something that's I've been fascinated with for a really long time. And in some preliminary trials, what we see is we don't have a large enough sample size to be able to for there to be a lot of power in what we're looking at. But there is a tendency for those that have grown up probably to rate themselves more highly and believe that they are more highly skilled than they typically are scored by an expert, which would indicate that, yes. The other piece of that, I think, is culturally, if we think about hiring practices and we think about just all of the cultures associated with the beef industry, the rich histories, that idea of growing up in it, the rich culture associated with that has translated to part of that story among the workforce. And that is a piece of credibility when it comes to hiring. If you're getting on a crew to work with your neighbor, spring branding, whatever it might be, typically we say, I grew up in it, or I've done it for this many years. And what's really interesting is that I'll use an example of another sector. When I was hiring auditors, we did not actually prefer to hire people that had previously audited because they might have had bad habits, and we see that among stockmen as well. While someone grew up with it, we probably all have the experience where we've seen fantastic examples of stockmanship among those people that were raised in it, that we might have grown up nearby. And then we also see the exceptions to that. So there's a continuum, and there's not. I think it's more about qualities that we haven't identified yet than it is only background.
Okay, I think that's totally fair, because I can think of examples of students who have come from pretty extensive beef background who were not open to suggestions of how to improve their handling skills. And especially in our research facility at Iowa State, we're small pen research. So as soon as you open the gate, you're putting pressure on those cattle. Like, even if you're not physically trying to do that, it's just a small pen, right? Like, they want to move away from you because you've moved into their space and you're still 15 feet away from them.
Yeah.
But then there's been the other example where that kid that comes with they're already confident enough around cattle and they've learned how to read the body language. And so they're not going to get buffaloed by a steer who's like, I'm going to try to run past you, but I'm not really, it's totally fine. I'm going to stop. Okay, fine, I'll stop. Right. As opposed to the
Right.
student who's never been around cattle. And we're so grateful to have those students and train them. And some of them become epic cattle handlers, just the best. And everybody's like, we want Grace because Grace is so good and Grace didn't grow up with cattle and whatever. So I think I totally agree with you that there is the continuum. And one of my questions here was going to be, do you think that having the trait of empathy, so I do a lot of stuff with Clifton Strengths, I'm a certified coach from that, and this trait of empathy, does that make you inherently a better stockman, or is that another thing that's on the continuum?
I don't think we know the answer to that yet. I came across a paper recently as I was looking at what did and didn't exist relative to skill. And it was fascinating that among veterinary students, they were really interested in empathy and their ability to perceive pain, the experience of pain in both humans and animals, for the veterinary students. And they found some really interesting things. First of all, of the group that they looked at, the female vet students tended to be able to have more empathy towards cattle, for example, if they were going to be using pain mitigation. And they could pick up some of the facial expressions, even in cattle, that are associated with pain more readily than their male counterparts. But what was really interesting is that empathy didn't necessarily extend to humans, for all of those people, which is very, very interesting as we think about the challenges of this workforce. So they might be really good at empathy with animals and not so good at empathy with humans, and perhaps vice versa. So the idea that maybe there's a continuum, and there's so much we don't know, but I think absolutely empathy is important if we're thinking more big picture about animal welfare. And we can't talk about animal welfare without talking about end of life. And I argue that empathy and actually a closer bond with animals is exactly what it takes to ensure that we'll make better decisions, even related to timeliness of euthanasia. An example.
Yeah. If you're listening and not watching on the YouTube, I'm pointing at myself right now because 100% very little empathy for the humans, lots of empathy for the people, and not in the sense that, it would stop you, but oftentimes it will be like okay, that this is the right decision for the animal right now, right? And whether that's like, okay, it's not going to work right now. I feel like that's, you see that stuff on Instagram, right? Where people are like, the best time, it's like husbands and wives, you scream at each other. I told you to get the black one. And it's like, which black one? And, like nobody's ever happy when they're working cattle, right? Especially if you have limited facilities, right? And so that's one of the big conversations I have with students. It's like, look, we're not running cattle, we're walking cattle. Yeah. Everybody's chill. And, I have this one former grad student that I was always just like, just go do what Dathan's doing. You see how he's just walking down there with his hands in his pocket, just strolling down the alleyway? Those cattle are like, yeah, he's back there, but whatever. I'm not having to like haul ass down the alleyway, right? And, so nobody gets hurt. And it's like, it's just so much in your body language that those animals respond to. I think that's fascinating.
Body language is so important. And I talk about communication a lot. And there's a couple components of communication. Animals are constantly communicating to us too. And it's our job to learn how to read. You used the word read earlier, which I really appreciate. Read their behavior, read what they're communicating. Because arguably in the context of skill and stockmanship, it's those missed cues that typically, end up in potentially injury or bluffing or, undesirable outcomes. So reading, they're constantly communicating. They're interested in engaging. All domesticated animals are highly social. And so there's this really interesting dynamic when we engage with them. And some are prefer to do that at a greater distance than others. Their engagement looks very different. But they're also looking at the types of cues that we're sending, what we're communicating, and how they can respond in a way that, as you mentioned earlier, use that word pressure, like either provide some relief from that pressure, and most of that's visual, right? When we talk about pressure with moving cattle, that's the primary form of pressure and restraint that we're using. It's mostly visual. I mean, they rely on their hearing to a lesser degree, typically when they can't see as well. So understanding that two-way street, and I think I still find it fascinating when I'm talking with people that haven't worked around cattle or livestock as much, and we start to talk about the differences in vision, even something about how much time it takes for their eyes to adjust compared to ours. If we're moving from outside to inside, for example, in most of our handling facilities, there's a component where we're moving them from outside to inside. And for us, our eyes might adjust in 30 seconds. And so we're operating on that time frame. And for them, it might take 5 minutes. And that's staggering if you stop and look at a watch, and slow down that much, right? Giving them the opportunity to ensure that there isn't a threat that they're moving towards. Those things are all really, really important. But the other piece of communication, to circle back to the whole idea of communication, and I think you touched on it really nicely, when you have a task to do, sort of communicating a plan. And it's not as simple as as other tasks, right? First we'll do A, and then we'll do B, and we'll do it on this timeline. But we tend to expect, I think, that working cattle needs to follow that same type of flow, like first A, then B, and we do it once, otherwise it's wrong. If we gather them all at once and it doesn't work properly, then something went wrong. We failed, which isn't the case. Planning, what our objectives are. An example of that, when I spent a lot of time training and involved working with horses and cattle, those animals needed to be quieter when I was done than when I started. And that is an example of an objective that you can have going into anything. So if we're moving cattle up to the processing barn, the fact that they're willing to walk away from the facilities instead of run, those are all indications that we're doing our job well. So by communicating a plan, what do we want to do? Well, we don't times when we go to move animals or we get quiet. We're not communicating with each other. And that's probably one of the bigger opportunities for us to improve when there's a couple people working animals, is to stop and slow down and be like, okay, now here's what I actually need you to do. I need you to do, can you do this? Can you stop? Do you see what, the brockle face is doing right now? Okay, now watch that and take a step back towards me and then a step to the right, and sort of walk through options where we change sort of our trajectory from we're just going to go in and we've got to move. We're in an environment where everything's all about time and efficiency, and like being busy and moving is evidence of productivity and success. And this is one of the few times where that rule just doesn't hold. Slowing down, giving them time to think through it, not always moving. Sometimes those are the best things that we can do. And that's probably one of the bigger barriers that we have to constantly address in this space, when we're constantly agitating, if you will, in everything else that we're doing.
So I want to take us a slightly different direction, but before I do, so you're an extension, right? So do you or will you anticipate doing some like farmer training kind of events, like field days and things like that? I was actually just thinking, like, we have Grant Duell at Iowa State, so we're lucky that he can come over and always do like kind of an annual update with our specifics of our facility. But I was like, oh, it'd be cool to send the students over to be able to, learn some more of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Last year, I participated in the NCBA stockmanship and stewardship tours. I focused specifically on components of facility design considerations, and not from the perspective of, oh, you should redesign it, but like these are designs that we commonly see, and these are potentials for, where we might see challenges in movement. And this is how to think about it. And this would be a way to position yourself differently in relationship to the animal in this particular context. So doing some pretty facility specific work. And then we did also some pasture handling demo out around Kearney. Kurt Pate and I were involved in that. And that was a lot of fun. So I love getting out doing field days, demonstrations. Oftentimes it might be one-on-one. I do some of that work in slaughter establishments as well, whether they might have had an enforcement action and need to do some training, or they actually have to look at facilities too if they're having issues with animal movement in a situation where the stakes are really high. But with the construction of the Classroom and Feedlot Innovation Center, to have the classroom there is a wonderful opportunity to host groups as well, whether that's other universities, whether that's producers, industry, whatever that might be. So the answer is yes.
Excellent. Okay, so before we come to the end of our interview and move into our 3 questions, one thing that I wanted to make sure we had a chance to talk about was this. So we're under considerable labor stress in the industry, right? And so we've been talking a little bit, how can artificial intelligence, how can some, like you mentioned, wearables, what are your thoughts on the places where these can be things that can relieve some of the burden associated with things that we do with stockmanship, or where are some things that you think maybe the humans are always going to beat the robots?
One, I think it's a tricky situation because when you start to talk about technology and jobs, that elicits a sort of a visceral response among the workforce, and this idea that they might be replaced by a robot or something like that. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I'm trying to just thinking about the impact, the implications of technology adoption and what that looks like and what it might look like in the future. And I do have concerns about where we choose to implement technology. And I guess my concern would be that while there's enormous benefit, for example, of using something like AI to support early detection of disease, whether that's helping support pen riders in the feedlot or whatever that might look like. That's a wonderful use of the technology, obviously using it in calling feed, that type of thing, wonderful applications. But I'm concerned about actually removing humans from the mix. And I mentioned Ed Page's work a little bit earlier. And one of the things that he found when looking at what we would call poor handling and good handling was that cattle didn't differentiate between irregular handling and poor handling, meaning that they actually, that not handling them frequently would cause the same amount of stress in a processing event or a handling event that we have to go through as handling them with less than good practices, like yelling and using electric prods. That suggests, and this is something that I spend a lot of time in class teaching too, this idea of the ancient contract and the human-animal relationship and what benefits the animal receives from human contact beyond just the provision of food and protection, that type of thing. But they're social animals and they're really interested in engaging with people. And by having people, and certainly you mentioned people that are capable of empathy and understand the impact of their behavior and are interested in cultivating good stockmanship practices, interacting with humans on a regular basis is truly tied to animal welfare and to their quality of life. But the converse is conversely, it's true for humans, is that if we ask our stakeholders why they choose to live and work with animals, it's not because it's lucrative. It's because of the quality of life, right? The meaning that they derive from lives devoted to living on the land, caring for animals. And that's where my deep love for the beef industry really comes from, is just seeing that in practice, having lived it, and wanting to protect that quality of life for both the human and animal that few other sectors really offer.
It's time for our famous three.
Ruth, this has been a really fun conversation. I'm pretty sure we could keep talking for another hour, but it is time for our famous three questions. So are you ready for these?
I hope so.
There's no wrong answer, so it's okay. Okay, first question. What's your favorite beef-related resource?
Today, I'd have to say that it's UNL Beef Extension. If you go to the UNL Beef website, I've had a lot of fun recently, even digging through some of the archived materials, even directed towards youth and some of their stockmanship practices. But there's a wealth of information, all things beef. What some of our recent materials have included how to feature beef at your branding, right, on the plate, as well as in our livelihood. So that'd be my favorite beef-related resource.
And she's contractually obligated to throw that one out there. That's what Matt...
I received no material compensation for that.
That's what Matt Spangler said when he said that.
Iowa State does some fantastic things. I have enormous respect for yourself, for duals, for a lot of people in the system there, both in extension and at the university. But like UNL Nebraska Extension, it's a machine.
It is, no doubt. I tease, but it's an amazing beef resource. There is no doubt.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, question number 2. What's something not related to beef that you're enjoying right now?
Well, I'm going to have to go with the podcast. And we talked earlier about your podcast and that I enjoy that a lot. But my favorite podcast is called The Art of Manliness. And that sounds kind of funny coming from a woman, perhaps. But what I really love about it is the enormous range of topics that they cover, from maybe ancient Greeks and the art of rhetoric to the protein guru, who's emeritus faculty at University of Illinois, for example. And through that, I've been turned on to some excellent research labs that might not have been on my radar otherwise. And this isn't a science-based podcast. So I love it.
Nice. I could see the inner nerd coming out there. I like that.
Art of rhetoric, ancient Greek. Yes, definitely nerd.
Highly appreciated. Okay, last question. What's a trait of someone you know that you think has helped make them successful?
I'm going to use the term project loyalty. And I know that's more a term perhaps than a trait. But I think what's appealed to me about that and what I've learned from that, and that was a concept that was taught to me by a mentor, was the idea of you focus on what really matters. It's easy for us to get pulled into the he said, she said, maybe getting toes stepped on type of thing. And by the idea of project loyalty keeps us focused on what really matters at the end of the day and helps us move efforts forward as a team and as an individual. So project loyalty.
I love that. One of my top 5 strengths is called significance, and it's about making impact. And I feel like that's what you're saying right there. Yep. It's like keeping the focus on the things that are going to have the impact.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that allows you, it's a different way of saying the exact same thing. It allows you to filter the chaff, right? The stuff that will distract you.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a super fun conversation. Thanks so much for agreeing to be on the Beef Podcast Show. Where can people find out more about you or follow you on socials or anything like that?
UNL Animal Science, my faculty page there gives a little bit of information about what I'm doing. On X, I guess, not Twitter anymore, X, it's Dr. Woiwode, and our Woiwode on Instagram, my name on Facebook, but UNL Animal Science webpage.
Excellent. And just a reminder to our listeners, you can find out more about the podcast on Instagram and LinkedIn. And we will see you next time.
Thanks so much, Stephanie.